Welcome everyone to the YANA virtual town hall in June. We're almost into July, halfway through the summer. This topic this evening is philanthropy's role in advancing racial equity. This is a follow-on to a lot of programs we've done on these topics. We're delighted to have some of our panelists and moderator returning, and to welcome a new person who's actually very well familiar with YANA and Ken and Nadomi and others. So I'm not going to take up some more time. I just wanted to let everyone know we are recording this. I will be monitoring the Q&A and the chat function, and the program is going to be moderated. The conversation will be moderated by a terrific person, Andrea McChristian, class of 2008, who is the Law and Policy Director of the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. I will let Andrea introduce the other two speakers. Please feel free to ask questions. We like to have a good, engaged conversation. We also have lots of resources we'll be able to share with you. And without further ado, I'll take myself offline, and Andrea, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and good evening, everyone. Again, my name is Andrea McChristian, and I'm the Law and Policy Director at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. For those of you unfamiliar with the Institute, we're a legal policy and advocacy organization based in the mighty city of Newark, New Jersey, that seeks to empower people of color by building reparative systems that create wealth, transform justice, and harness democratic power from the ground up here in New Jersey. And I'm proud to serve as your moderator for tonight's panel, exploring the powerful topic of philanthropy's role in advancing equity, with our esteemed panelists, Marco Davis, CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, and Antony Bugg-Levine, CEO of the Nonprofit Finance Fund. And a special thank you to Ken and YANA for providing tonight's forum. I'll open tonight's program with just some brief framing remarks before introducing Marco and Antony, who will also share some opening words. We'll then turn to a guided conversation before leaving about 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So as Rachel mentioned, please feel free to drop any questions you may have that arise in the Q&A chat below. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the events of the past year have radically transformed our nation. And nowhere has this impact been more greatly felt than in the area of racial justice. The dual storm of the COVID-19 pandemic and America's racial reckoning following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and so many other unarmed Black people has led to the exposure of the deeply embedded cracks of structural racism in our foundation that have erupted into earthquakes in our Black and Brown communities. For example, here in New Jersey, where my organization is based, a state associated with great prosperity, we're also home to some of the worst racial disparities in the nation. Not only do we have the highest Black to white infant mortality rate in the nation, but we also have the highest Black to white youth and adult incarceration disparity rates in the country, one of the starkest racial wealth gaps in America, and we are one of the top 10 most segregated school districts for Black students nationwide. And as a nonprofit organization, our work is largely sustained by philanthropic support aimed to tackle these numerous racial disparities here in the Garden State. But what happens if, rather than combating these racial inequities, the philanthropic sector works to perpetuate them? Because while we have seen a heightened fervor for foundations to be associated with explicit racial justice funding as a result of the events of the past year, research has shown that this dedicated level of funding has traditionally been denied to nonprofits led by people of color. And this is so even though people of color are clearly the experts on their lived experiences and what resources are needed to combat the racial inequities that disproportionately impact their communities. Indeed, as Edgar Villanueva outlines in his book, Decolonizing Wealth, the racial wealth gap that we see in New Jersey and across the nation has crept into the philanthropic sphere, with foundations that in many cases have achieved their fortunes due to the exploitation of Black and Brown labor, now using the same wealth to largely fund organizations that are white-led and or do not center the voices and experiences of the communities of color that they serve. And at the same time, nonprofit organizations led by people of color, already subject to numerous racial inequities from the start, some of which I just listed, are forced to not only do the work they are called to do within their communities, but also must compete for needed dollars against white-led and centered organizations that in many cases have larger networks and connections and formal development shops, further compounding racial inequities in what organizations get funded. And the stats bear this out, a few of which I'll highlight now. As Echoing Green and the Bridgespan Group recently reported, the philanthropic sector is largely homogenous. with 92% of foundation presidents and 83% of full-time staff members being white. And according to research from New Profit, Marco's previous organization, people of color are largely shut out of leadership opportunities within the sector. For example, while Black and Latino individuals make up 30% of the US population, they only account for 10% of nonprofit executive leadership and 6% of foundations executive leadership. Social networks, which are key to effective fundraising for nonprofits, also break down along racial lines, with in general 3/4 of white people having entirely white social networks. Further, organizations led by Black and Latino leaders receive an estimated 4% of total grants and contributions in the social sector. And these same organizations tend to receive more restricted funding, limiting their flexibility and the ability to grow their organizations. And this philanthropic spending is also overlooking the backbone of numerous civil rights movements, women of color. As Vanessa Daniel, executive director of Groundswell, wrote in a 2019 New York Times op-ed, only 0.6% of foundation giving was targeted to women of color in 2016. In addition, other barriers like implicit bias, an inability to build rapport between funders and nonprofit leaders of color, success measurement structures that lack cultural competence, and the philanthropic sector's tendency to fund the same organizations over and over rather than branching out to fund smaller budget and often more innovative organizations that are highly effective, have led to a disconnect between racial justice rhetoric and meaningful funding for racial justice organizations that center communities of color. And that's why we're here today, to have a frank conversation where we turn a microscope on the philanthropic sector to understand how it has traditionally addressed racial inequities, how this approach has changed, if at all, during this moment of racial reckoning, and how we can sustain this funding movement going forward to make sure it's not just a moment in time. And I'm honored to dive into this conversation with our esteemed panelists who are so knowledgeable in these issues. First, I'm joined by Marco Davis. Marco is CEO of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, the premier Hispanic nonpartisan nonprofit organization in the country dedicated to developing the next generation of Latino leaders. Prior to his current role, Marco was a partner at New Profit, a national venture philanthropy, where he led diversity, equity, and inclusion. Marco also previously served on the Yale Alumni Task Force on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Thank you for being with us, Marco. And next, we are joined by Antony Bugg-Levine, CEO of the nonprofit Finance Fund, one of the nation's leading community development financial institutions. Antony oversees more than $350 million of investment capital while developing innovative approaches to advancing social change. I know that my organization has personally benefited from our valued partnership with NFF. Of note, Antony recently announced that after almost 10 years of service, he will be stepping down from NFF to allow it to have leadership that better embodies its new strategic focus on racial equity, and specifically the ability to help organizations led by people from the communities they serve to take power over resources. I look forward to hearing more about that in our discussion. Thanks for being with us, Antony. I'll now turn it to Marco to kick us off with his opening remarks. Marco?
Thank you, Andrea. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to dive into this conversation with you all and to join Antony. I think you said a lot, which I think really helps frame, and I think it's worth getting into the conversation. The only thing I'll mention, I think that to round out a piece is my optimism, my hope. I was a history major at Yale, and so I have a tendency to take sort of a long lens view of issues and of society and of where we are. And for me, the bulk of my career has been in the nonprofit sector, now more than 25 years. And issues of race, of course, have been with me my whole life. And so the thing for me that's worth noting, and I know we're going to get into sort of parsing out the thoughts about sort of what this moment in time, but the thing I wanted to say is that I am very hopeful and optimistic because even though it was born out of incredible tragedy, the interesting thing is that where we are as a society is we've taken steps forward in beginning a conversation in a much more open, in a much more widespread, and in a much more frank and candid way than I think I've ever seen before. right? As we're going to talk about, as I suspect our viewers know, right? Issues of race, issues of bias, issues of inequity in the nonprofit sector and philanthropy's approach are absolutely nothing new. But prior to 2020, I would say they were more often whispered about than spoken about out loud. They were more often talked about, for example, among communities of color than between communities of color and white leaders, right? It was the kind of thing that you didn't break up. I pointed out to my colleagues, to my coworkers, probably 7 months or so ago, that I was like, I have been in the workplace for many, many years, and I can't think of, before 2020, I can't think of a staff meeting where someone could say the words institutional racism without somebody being like, is HR here? Do we need an expert? Are we, because it was kind of forbidden, right? And it's now been broken open to the point where there's still a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of problems, but we're actually speaking about it in ways that aren't hushed tones, that aren't sort of checking first to see who's in the room and who's listening, so that we actually might find a way through to get to some solutions. And so for me, that's one of the exciting things about a conversation like tonight, because people are sincere in wanting to say, how do we get past the shock that this is happening, like a scene out of Casablanca, and rather get truly to solutions, to actions, to actually bringing about positive change. So I'm looking forward to the dialogue.
Great. Thank you so much for those opening remarks, Marco. I'll turn to Antony.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrea and Marco. And I said this on LinkedIn or something this week, but I love being on panels where I literally would be watching if I could and I wasn't participating, which isn't always, you guys know this, it's not always the case. Sometimes you're like, here, you hear your talking points and move on, but super excited to learn from the two of you. My work in this area has been the most humbling and at times disorienting thing I've ever done. So I don't come here with truths to teach. I really come here with huge humility and recognizing that we all have a lot to learn from each other. Just picking up on Marco's point, I like your framing, Marco, like what makes you optimistic. I've talked in the past about the fact that when I think about where leadership comes from and the people I really admire, and I think of Dr. King and my grandmother, who was a Holocaust survivor, but I knew her as an optimistic person. I think leadership power that I observed comes from people who can balance outrage and optimism. Because if you're just outraged, it's hard to sort of galvanize people to action. And if you're just optimistic, then it's easy to lose touch. And I think it's been for many years easy to be outraged about America. And yet for me, Marco, picking up on your point about optimism, it's the leaders like the two of you. Andrea, I know Ryan, who runs the Institute, who's amazing. In my work at Nonprofit Finance Fund, we work with thousands of nonprofits around the country, increasingly 60% of which are led by people of color, many of whom are community connected. And every time I engage with one of our nonprofit leader clients, I can't help but be optimistic because of their commitment, their creativity, their savvy, their power. And yet when you step back from that, you also recognize how incredibly powerful the systems that want to hold them back are. And I think those two things are real. But to your point, maybe just get right at it. I was at the Rockefeller Foundation previously. I've been in NFF for 10 years. Prior to that, I was at Rockefeller, and I remember just a few years ago, I had a conversation with someone who I'd known from my philanthropy time, and she was a program officer at a major national foundation, and she came to me, and to your point about whispers, she said, we're doing a big initiative. It's an open competition. There's $1 million prize at the end of it, and what do you think about whether we should be asking for applicants to say what their racial identity of their leadership is? And I said, well, you're a foundation who have publicly committed to racial equity. How would you know that you're meeting that commitment if you didn't at least know who you're giving grants to? And she said, well, that's what I've been saying, but I've lost the argument. And she said, I think it's generational. She was a young millennial in her early 30s at the time. She said, the younger staff members think this is obvious. The older staff members who hold decision power are uncomfortable with this. And I wonder, I'm tempted to text her right now and say, well, how do you think that would go down now? I would hope that at a minimum, to your point, the contours of where comfort has shifted, and that it should be a no-brainer that you would be, as a major philanthropy, asking that question. And I hope increasingly it would be uncomfortable for a foundation not to know the answer to that question. And so I think we'll get into this question of, is this here to stay or have things changed? But there's no doubt in my mind that there is an opening. I'm not super optimistic that the counter forces aren't going to reform and push back. But I think that's, I think where we are now is it's undeniable that there's a moment in time where certain things are shifting, hugely in balance as to what that means in the long run. And ultimately, that's all that matters.
Thank you so much, Antony and Marco, for those opening remarks. So I can already tell we're going to be in for a great conversation. So again, if you have any questions that arise while you're in the audience, please drop something in the Q&A chat box. We'd love to hear from you. So just turning right to the beginning of the questions. As we've already discussed a bit, there's been for some time now a consensus that the philanthropic sector really needs to reckon meaningfully with racial justice and racial equity, where nonprofit organizations should be kind of focused on leading by and centering voices of color that are often overlooked for critical funding opportunities. Yet at the same time, we all know in this call, and I'm sure in the audience, that we can't do meaningful philanthropic work without an explicit foundation of racial justice and racial equity, because it implicates so many of the issues that we're trying to address through funding. For both of you, as we just heard, we know this conversation is nothing new. Just in the research I was doing and preparing for moderating this decades ago, we started talking about this issue that has reached a fever pitch within the past year. Could you both touch a little bit more on how philanthropy has intersected with race traditionally, and how in this moment and moving forward, we feel that the sector can fund racial justice work in a meaningful way to affect lasting change, touching upon your personal experiences. So I'll kick it to Antony first, because I know, as I mentioned in your introduction, your organization is doing meaningful work on this front. We'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, and I was hoping to defer to Marco because I know he has direct experience as a philanthropist. I mean, to be honest, so we are a little bit of we're like a philanthropy adjacent. So, I run a community finance organization. We raise money from banks and others. We make loans. And in that regard, we are acting like philanthropists in that we are making decisions as to who is going to have access to capital. We also do a lot of work with foundation clients and nonprofit clients like you guys, Andrea, where we are helping nonprofit leaders and some foundations gain access to financial knowledge that helps them, make more resilient decisions around how the work gets done. So I think we're in this work without being entirely in it. I'd say when I was at the Rockefeller Foundation, again, I mean, nothing against them. My boss there was Darren Walker. Many of you know him. He's now the head of Ford. Amazing guy, unassailably committed to racial equity. But it didn't, to Marco's point, I don't think the words racial equity probably came up. And I was there between 2007 and 2011. So I think my experience is more what's happened with us. And Nonprofit Finance Fund, we are 41 years old, and I've been leading it for the last 10 years. It wasn't until the summer of 2016 that we really confronted these issues explicitly. I think, again, if you'd asked people who had been at the organization, they would have self-identified as liberal, pro-racial equity. I mean, who in our social circles isn't? But we didn't really begin this work, and it's been really transformational. And again, I don't think anyone on this call needs to be convinced that it's important, but it's changed everything for NFF, that we have reinterrogated everything we do through an explicit understanding of how race plays out in the communities we serve. That's the core thing that we did. And I'm proud that we did it in 2016 in the summer and not on November 10th. I think it was, important bit of context is 3 things happened that summer that sort of pushed us in this direction. One was, that was the summer where in the last week of June, the first week of July, Alton Sterling and Philando Castile got murdered. And then in Dallas that weekend, there was the police shooting. And, my team members came to me and said, we like being an organization that works to make the nonprofit sector better, but it just seems a little ancillary to this core issue that our nation is facing around racial equity. So there was a call from the team to link the work we were doing around helping the philanthropic system be more effective to some explicit understanding of how that could affect racial equity. We also had, frankly, internally within the team, we had staff members, particularly staff members of color, who were saying, we are experiencing NFF in a way that is not as salutary as you might think we are. And there are things happening to us that we understand to be aggressive and alienating. And so that was an eye-opener for people willing to listen. Again, to your point, nothing that probably hadn't happened all along, but we had some really brave colleagues who stood up and said, we're going to be explicit about this. And then the last thing that happened was, and I think this is the most instructive, we had a client, an amazing client, actually in the arts sector, a nonprofit in the arts sector that's a Black-led and Black-serving organization. And my team one of my team members went to do our usual consulting work, and we sort of say, here's what good practice is around financial management, and here's what the donors and the philanthropic sector wants you to be like. You should have reserves, you should be budgeting your surpluses. And someone in that group stood up and said, I will not listen to you tell me what to do until you acknowledge and repair the harms you have created as an institution by perpetuating a set of oppressive norms around finance for the philanthropic sector to adopt. And the context of that intervention was that for many years, my organization has been working with foundations to establish what best practice means for nonprofits in managing finances. And we were doing it through a well-meaning and ultimately destructive race-neutral perspective. And so one of the things we had said was that well-run nonprofit organizations create surpluses, and those surpluses lead to operating reserves. And we were challenged at that moment by someone who said, that has created a stigmatizing norm by which our funders judge us because we operate in communities that have been asset stripped for 350, 400 years. And therefore, it is harder for us to meet the same standards that you have as an organization with our funders imposed on us. And so that was so powerful. And I'll be forever grateful for the staff members who stood up, for our clients who stood up, and together with a board that is increasingly engaged in this issue, it really led us on a path we've been working on. I'll stop by just saying that was accelerated last summer, and we absolutely are where we are today because of the uprisings related to the murder of Mr. Floyd. And I think the key thing was a call I got from my board chairman last August, where he said, I can't answer my community, and he's self-identified as a Latinx man, and he said, I can't answer my community's question as to what NFF is doing to advance racial equity with words anymore. You don't come at me with the trainings and the new website and the new value, and which is all awesome. He said, we will be measured by what we do. And I think that's the spirit of 2020 that is undeniable. And I've seen this in so many places. I did an interview with Andrea, with Ryan you work with, and talking about, how that is playing out. I'm just seeing this around the country where more and more nonprofit organizations, and hopefully funders as well, are just not willing to sit aside and manage around everyone's comfort, people in power's comfort. And so that's, again, a lot of unfinished work for us, but it's been a journey, and we've learned a lot. And I think it's really allowed us to be the last thing I say is it's allowed us to be much more effective. It's not like we've had to sort of compensate or add something on. It's allowed us to see everything we do and just be so much more insightful in how we work.
Thank you, Antony, for those opening reflections to the question. Marco, I'll turn it to you to either answer the initial question or any reflections you had to Antony's remarks.
Yeah, maybe a little of both. I would say, I think two thoughts come to mind as I thought about your question in terms of sort of where philanthropy's at and what it needs to do and sort of where we are as a society. One is, I was recently introduced to a frame of thinking around solving social issues, which is known as the Groundwater Approach. I don't know if you all are familiar with it. I had heard of sort of an earlier version that fell a little short, which was which I think is a perfect kind of allegory or analogy around sort of sometimes the flawed approach traditionally that philanthropy originally used, which was sort of pinpointed individual or individualized types of interventions as an attempt to solve for social problems, right? And so the story the Groundwater Approach is built on, I only heard the first half originally that I used to hear people give the example of, which was if you were fishing and you found that fish were diseased and damaged and dying, would you blame the fish, right? And in many ways in society, that was one of the things that we did as a structural society, was that we were faulting individuals and families and entire communities as though there was something inherently wrong with them, and that the problem was to fix the individual and the family and the community, as opposed to understanding that there was probably something in the water that was causing these fish to be diseased. It wasn't a genetic flaw in all of these fish, right? And I thought that was a really great, more macro level kind of approach. This Groundwater Approach takes that argument a step further, which I think is really profound because and particularly is apropos right now. And thank you, someone, for putting up the link, because it actually talks about that racism, structural, institutional, systemic racism that we finally started talking about is essentially not even just like the water that the fish are swimming in, but it's actually the groundwater that permeates everything. And as a result, it infiltrates and so you can't, first of all, isolate one pond and sort of say, we're just going to, and which again, oftentimes well-intentioned, but short-sighted sort of philanthropic efforts sort of say, we're just going to focus on this pond and we're going to fix everything we can on this pond. We're going to keep it clean and good, and the fish in this pond are going to be great. But when you realize with the groundwater, if the groundwater is contaminated, it's seeping in everywhere, and you cannot isolate one pond from another. And you can't even sort of say, we're not going to work in the pond at all, we're going to work on the soil. Well, the groundwater is everywhere, right? And so you realize that that is sort of the underpinning in our society. And that's a new frame, a new approach. It's a new example I heard, which really radically changes the way you think about the issues you're trying to address, the problems you're trying to solve, and even the ways in which you will arrive at seeing a situation where an individual or a family, or in fact, an entire community may have by a measure deficits, but you start to realize again that there's nothing inherently wrong in those individuals. Oftentimes there's nothing inherently wrong with those individuals or families or communities. It's the groundwater that has been contaminated all around them, within which they've been trying to advance, to grow, to develop, right? And so then when you realize what you want, when people talk about root causes, that's really a profound way to do it. So that's the one thing that that came to mind in terms of like where we are and why things hopefully won't go back to the way they were, because once you're aware of the groundwater, it's very hard to be like, I don't care about the groundwater, I'm just focusing on my pond. Because again, many very wise people will sort of be like, it's never going to work, you can't isolate it. With that, I'll also push a little further. The second thought I had was, and in some ways, Antony mentioned some of these, talking about examples. I also think it's important not to fully let philanthropy off the hook. And by the way, to be fair and fully transparent, we were somewhat, I at New Profit was also sort of quasi-philanthropic in that it was a venture philanthropy. It's actually a C3 itself. It raises money, but it does then award grants. So it didn't have an endowment to rely on, or a family fund to draw down from. So we had a bit of both worlds of operating like philanthropy, but also operating like a nonprofit. And that actually gave much more insight in terms of being practitioners, and which therefore gives me much more comfort being able to sling arrows, if you will, at our colleagues in the philanthropic world. Because as you said, even before this groundwater approach was known and was used and was popularized, and even if people are unaware, there is sometimes a naive at best and willfully neglectful frame and approach and perspective that I think needed to be challenged. And again, and frankly, finally is beginning to be challenged, which is that many times in philanthropy, the solutions people and the frames that people and the approaches that people had simply sort of claimed to be focused on an issue and sort of saying racial justice is its own thing. And we don't do that. We do education, we do housing, we do climate, and not understanding that like racism and racial inequity informs and affects and impacts, right, all of the things around us. It is, as it's often described, it is in the air and it affects all of us. It permeates everything in our society, intentional or not, and many times often as a result of many years of work, many years in the past. But it has created conditions such that it's essentially impossible. And as a result, you had people sort of saying that we work in and fund and provide philanthropy to specific issues that are race neutral, that don't take into effect race, the racial components, the racial dynamics. But again, it was often fairly easy to show the data around why the population you happen to be serving was often underrepresented and often marginalized in all sorts of euphemistic terms, but that basically were as a result of these structures and systems in society. And again, the reason I sort of open provocatively about this whole example is the one issue that I think is still not really being addressed. And in fact, I saw in the Q&A, somebody mentioned it with regard to boards of trustees. The one interesting thing about philanthropy that isn't said anywhere near enough is that there, as compared to other sectors, there are at times much fewer mechanisms of accountability for philanthropy as compared to anyone else. So as we were saying, philanthropy often didn't track the racial dynamic, the racial demographics of folks they funded, and no one required them to report it, right? No one even was able to ask, because most of the people most interested in asking were often potentially grantees, and therefore they didn't want to risk the relationship with philanthropy. And as a result, philanthropy wasn't held accountable. Philanthropy doesn't have to report to the EEOC the same data that the private sector companies do, et cetera, right? And so as a result, they're able to profess and to share principles and philosophical approaches that profess to believe in equity and equality, but they're not necessarily forced to disclose the ways in which they're trying to bring that about. And as a result, they're often sometimes able to avoid that kind of accountability, to show actual ways in which they're changing the situation, as opposed to simply believing in the concept.
Great, thank you so much, Marco. And since you mentioned, I actually did want to ask this trustees question, because I was interested in hearing both of your thoughts. So this is an audience question that we received. Foundation trustees have enormous power, yet too few foundation boards have trustees of color who have lived experience on the receiving end of racial inequity. As a trustee myself, I have found foundations much more comfortable with comfortable people of color on their boards. What ideas do you have for addressing racial equity and including lived experience with racial inequity on foundation boards? So Marco, since you kind of pivoted us towards there a little bit, I'll throw it to you, and then Antony would love to hear your thoughts as well.
Sure. I'd say sort of two things I think that might be useful as attempts at solutions on this. And here's a perfect example, right? Where no one requires foundations to include anyone on their board of trustees they don't feel like, and there isn't even really much negative blowback, if you will, or there aren't many downsides to a board of trustees, to a foundation keeping the board of trustees as whoever they want, and it not being diverse and all of those things. I mean, there's critiques, but again, it's just sort of negative publicity. But again, in many ways, they can be fairly, they can keep themselves fairly immune to that. But for folks who want to try and address it, I'd say two things. One is, which is increasingly happening, thank heavens, this idea of lived experience, this idea of insights gained from personal experience is being valued more than it was in the past, and in some ways at least compared, maybe not equated to yet, and maybe, I don't know if it ever will, but it's certainly now compared to professional experience and hard skills, whether it be in finance or legal and all the other kinds of skill sets that people often put on board matrices when they're looking for board members and boards of trustees. Lived experience, proximity to the impact of the issue that the foundation is trying to address. The insights gained from that, again, are being held up more and more as having value and being worth looking at, and as being a resource that is a different and more intangible resource than actual, for example, access to capital, but that is still has value, and again, and provides meaningful contribution to, at a minimum, the dialogue, especially when coupled with sort of all of the data that increasingly shows that a more diverse group of people just simply make better decisions, right? Study after study sort of shows that the more diversity, the less homogeneity you have among a group of people making decisions, whether it be a corporate board of directors or a foundation board, or simply a team working on a problem, that heterogeneity of perspectives increasingly leads to better results, right? So that's one. The other thing I would sort of say is that the other solution is, again, and it's in some of the literature that we have in our sharing, which is, and that people are talking about in terms of solutions of addressing racial equity in general, in most cases, which is this whole piece of that so much of the philanthropic, the nonprofit, and frankly, the world in general is predicated on relationships. And so one of the challenges you often have, particularly among groups like boards of trustees and foundations, is that they're fairly insular networks, right? And the people who are on the boards of trustees really only know other types of people, and the few, as the questioner put it, comfortable types of people of color, et cetera, who may have similar backgrounds, like may have gone to similar auspicious institutions of the Ivy League and other places, right, or have similar backgrounds. And so those are seen to be more, because they're familiar, and there are sort of common bonds on which you can build. And when people force themselves to be exposed to, and as a result, develop relationships with people from more diverse backgrounds, eyes are open pretty quickly. And then people sort of realize all the wealth and breadth and insight and creativity that other people bring to the table. And by forcing those networks to be more diverse, to be more varied, then that also helps the process of really pushing and challenging for different types of people to be considered as candidates for boards of trustees.
Thank you, Marco. So Antony, I'll throw the same question to you, but also add on a kind of a related question. We know that there's really a dearth of nonprofit organizations led by people of color, and they're often generally overlooked for funding opportunities for a number of reasons. What do you think that the sector can specifically do to support, empower, and fund these leaders of color? And for nonprofits not led by people of color, what considerations do you think they should take into account? So you can handle the board of trustees, the leaders of the organization, then Marco, I'll circle back to you after to see if you have any flavor to add on to it as well. So
and interestingly, they're related. I think the board question is actually very related to this question of how do you create a more equitable flow of resources to organizations that have greater proximity. It's a similar question. Why is it that boards, even if they are racially diverse, are not diverse in terms of balancing people with corporate experience and people with proximate experience? So just make this personal. When I was at the Rockefeller Foundation, we had quite a racially diverse board. And I mean, I admired and learned a lot from the African Americans on our board. They weren't the talented 10th. They were like the talented 1/100th of 1/100th. I mean, these were like the 3 Fortune 50 CEOs who happened to be Black and, you know, one of the leading nonprofit leaders of the country. I mean, they were absolutely, as not surprisingly, almost more credentialed with all the signifying credentials of academic performance and corporate success than the other members of the board. But you know, they were really great board members and obviously brought a perspective. That's very different than having someone on the board who's lived experiences in a community in which the organization works. So I think it's complicated, but I think, you know, the challenge is how do you get boards to be strategic rather than responsive? So right now there's going to be a call out there, which says all white boards are outrageous for foundations. You know, to your point, both of you were making, they're not exactly accountable, but I feel like for most boards that are not trying to be just obstinate at this point in 2021, they're going to respond in some way. They're going to find a way to answer that charge. And the responsive is to put, you know, as they've done in the past, people whose ascriptive racial identities is diversifying, even if their perspectives are not. So I think that's sort of the response. The more strategic question, this gets to your point about how do you end up creating a world in which more philanthropy is channeled toward organizations that are truly accountable, responsive, and proximate to the communities they serve. Well, that's got to come from a groundswell of understanding that you get better results as a philanthropist when you channel resources, both money and other forms of power, to proximate leaders. I don't think you can separate the two. You can't expect people to start putting, if you say, hey, put these guys on your board because we on the outside demand it, that's tokenizing. If on the other hand, we all create a compelling, and I think argument sort of implies it's intellectual. I don't think it's an argument. It's a compelling movement that socializes this recognition that the reason you want to diversify your boards with perspectives, as Marco said, and the reason you want to shift more of your funding to organizations that are accountable to communities is because you actually will get better results. And I think it's got to be in both cases the same argument that this isn't about, I mean, there is absolutely a justice argument as well, but I think what's really going to be persuasive is the point that we are asking foundations to trade the comfort and control they currently feel operating the way they have for impact. And that is a trade that I hope many foundations will make if they can be convinced that it's real. I think there are some who, you know, I guess I'm not so cynical as to think that foundations don't on some level want to optimize for impact. I'm also not so naive as to think that's their only motivation. There's obviously a lot of other things going on, but I think we've got to, as a movement, popularize and socialize a recognition that by not diversifying their boards and that by not doing the hard work to move out of their comfort zone that currently prohibits their money flowing to where it could flow, that foundations are losing impact. I think that's and I know there's a great article in the chat from Travian Shorters on asset framing. I really think shaming foundations is going to move a little bit of people. It's not where you're going to get a groundswell of change. I think that's going to come from helping foundations recognize that there's massive assets in these communities in the form of leaders who are accountable, responsive, and proximate, who are going to be the greatest converters of foundation money into impact, and that it's in everyone's interest to overcome our own comfort that is stopping us connecting to them. I think if you frame it that way, I think that is sustaining. I don't think the there will be a backlash. It's inevitable. I mean, white supremacy doesn't cede power without a struggle. It never has. It never will. We know that. In our little world, that's the form it's going to take. There's going to be a backlash in a few years where foundations are going to say, we are not going to anymore ask anyone the identity of the racial identity because we believe that that is inequitable. We know that's coming. And I don't think we're going to be able to stop everyone being a part of it, but can there be a critical mass that is in this period of openness convinced that this is a better way to do it? And the last thing I'll say, I don't think it's an argument. I think it's a socialization process, because I've observed in my work on impact investing, which is different but related, it's about getting people out of their worldview to see the world in a new way. You cannot, I don't think people's, and in most cases it's unintentional biases and sort of barriers come from a reasoned place. It's not like foundation trustees have analyzed, should we be diverse or not, and let's not because there's a case for it. It's just what they've been socialized into. I don't think you can fight ideologically and socially derived positions with analysis. I don't think we can produce another 20 reports because they didn't get to their position analytically. They got to their position through ideology and socialization. So we have to change the social pressures. And that's why I think it's about making it uncomfortable to keep doing things the way you are. And that doesn't come from the three of us writing better papers. It comes from them and their peers starting to create different norms. It should be socially unacceptable to walk into a room with your fancy foundation friends and not know the racial makeup of your grantees. And I think we're on the verge of making that happen in a lot of places. It wasn't that case a few years ago. So I think it's about how do you mobilize that social pressure in a smart way.
Thank you, Antony. And so we have about 15 minutes left. So Marco, I'm going to throw it back to you, but I want to weave in a related audience question. I got to keep the panelists on their toes. So the Groundswell Fund organization has published an open letter to nonprofits engaged in racial equity issues, asking them to sign on to the argument that white-led organizations are having a negative or at least a suboptimal effect by consuming the time and energy of people of color experts they engage, and they should just give money directly to people of color-led organizations instead of developing initiatives of their own. Many such organizations have signed the letter in support. What are your thoughts on this, and what do you think are the pros and cons to this approach? Again, it's all related to this main point about leadership and who has power. So I'll throw it to you, Marco.
Yeah, without knowing the details of the letter, I mean, I think certainly providing more resources and support to organizations that are steeped in the work and deeply knowledgeable about the work and have expertise and insight on the work, and so in many cases are going to be led by people of color, I think makes a ton of sense, certainly more than foundations spending all of their time seeking to become experts on those same issues that other people are already expert on, while still being one step removed. So I think that certainly makes sense. I mean, the one piece I might push back a little on is, again, and without, I heard you say it, it sounds like the call is to give all of the resources just directly over and to sort of give it up completely. My one thing is, I think, the one thing I think, however, is that we need, well, there should be a mechanism somewhere by which white leaders, and in this case, for example, leadership of existing philanthropies, also learn, right? And so again, I 100% agree that it should not be sort of on the backs of people of color having to teach them, and certainly not at their own expense, which I thought was where some of that letter was going, about the classic example of bringing in consultants for people of color to give workshops and advice and guidance, and sometimes for free, and even if compensated, it's sort of very minimal and it's not sustainable long term, and it's just to make the white leaders better for their own sake. But I think, again, I sort of think that in a fully equitable and inclusive society, we have to figure out what the role of white people is going to be. It clearly has to be a different role than it is now, but they have to still be a part of the society and the culture and of the system. And so the question is, what is the new role for them? And I think that needs to be part of the equation. Again, the leaders, the organizations led by people of color who do have expertise may actually have a theory on that. And so if they do, then perfect. I think then absolutely support them to share and explain and guide people on how to do it. But that's a piece of the puzzle in my mind to do so. The other thing I would say, though, is that, and in some ways this can be in that same direction as that letter, which is something Antony was saying, which is What I also think is needed in terms of how to get more resources to organizations led by people of color is that we need to have metrics. We need to have rigor. We need to have that kind of accountability where people need to be reporting the numbers so that people can be uncomfortable, not only going into the room not knowing, but in fact can also be uncomfortable if the number is not a great number, right? And so that's the piece too, where we're making all of that much more transparent, much more visible, and organizations then will be pressured to, because again, at the end of the day, it's all going to be voluntary. There aren't mechanisms and there aren't even proposals designed to force anybody to do these things. But so they need to voluntarily decide to significantly increase their giving to organizations led by people of color, to have ratios, to have percentages, to have impacts, as was pointed out in some of the initial research that we talked about, so that the numbers aren't fewer dollars, shorter term dollars, and more restricted dollars, but in fact are comparable, if not more equitable, right, than the money given to organizations led by white folks, based on the issue that you're trying to address, based on the problem that you're trying to solve. The ratio might actually need to be inverted and not just 50-50 because of the communities you're trying to impact. And so I think if all of those things happen, then I think we'll get closer to where I think what I heard you say is that letter is trying to go, of foundations not simply saying we're going to solve it ourselves by simply getting better at understanding racial justice, but in fact, why don't they just turn to the people who understand, who've already been, as you mentioned, for decades actually working on racial justice.
Great, thank you, Marco. And so with a little over 10 minutes left, I think I'd like to combine two audience questions to both of you and then just conclude with your closing remarks. Is this a moment in time, or is this kind of sustained focus on race? Is this focus on racial equity we're now going to be sustained? And if we want to take a more critical view to say, maybe not, how do we fight against that and make sure that it is? But first, the audience questions I want to combine are one of the best practices for advancing racial justice in philanthropy is to incorporate participatory decision-making processes where those most impacted by funding decisions contribute meaningfully or have autonomy over funding decisions. Have you encountered any successful examples of this at the foundational level? And the second one is, foundations will often say we can't find these high-performing organizations led by people of color. How do we guide and help foundations find and fund them? So I'll open it if either of you has a burning urge to answer one of those. I'll open it up to whoever would like to respond first.
I mean, I know, right? So maybe on the second one. So my friend Cheryl Dorsey, who runs Echoing Green, who's awesome, she's like, guys, it's not complicated. Just write incredibly large checks to Black-led intermediaries who know who those groups are. Like, it is just an excuse to say you haven't found. Well, if you haven't found these organizations, other people have. Like, and you know, Crystal Haling at Libra Foundation, who's awesome. She did this panel last year. She has an incredible group of grantees. What she did was invite other funders to just co-fund her group effectively. And I mean, I really admire her as a philanthropic leader because she took this challenge on herself. She's like, I found these amazing leaders. So now you've got some of the largest foundations in the US who wouldn't have been able to find, and mostly they're Black women-led organizations, a lot of them in the Southeast, which is underfunded. There's no excuse, honestly. I get frustrated. You're drawing a paycheck partly subsidized by the US taxpayers by working in philanthropy that doesn't pay capital gains tax. Like, if you cannot solve this question, just step aside and make room for people who can. I mean, I'm getting a little emotional here, but that's just frustrating. Like, for everything this country went through last year and the people who risked their lives in the middle of a pandemic to go out in the streets to demand justice, and your comfort level is leaving you unable to even make this leap.
If I could, the one thing I'd add to that, Antony, I agree with all that. And the one thing I would also sort of say is really check what your goals and what your end result is. Because I would sort of also say, in addition to doing those things, if you have a set, if you have a structure in mind, and first of all, again, if you check it against sort of oppressive white supremacy norms that are not particularly productive and constructive and or lead to efficient organizations. If you've already screened for that and what you feel is a well-run, well-structured organization, you have a model in mind, and all the organizations led by people of color that you're running into don't fit that model, maybe your funding should be to train and support and provide resources to those organizations to meet that model, as opposed to simply saying, I need to go find organizations that have somehow, against all of the barriers that are society has thrown at them have somehow overcome those challenges and have managed to meet this model, maybe you should be investing in earlier stage, smaller nonprofits and doing more capacity building support for the leaders and for the organizations so that they can build the systems and the structures and all of the things that you feel are best practices in the nonprofit space so that they can be effective. Because odds are what they are doing is meeting the community where they are and solving the problems that the community needs. They just don't have all this other infrastructure and scaffolding that you're talking about. And maybe your funding should be directed to helping them with that scaffolding as opposed to saying, I need to keep looking.
And if I could just add, and the scaffolding needs to be what enables them to be resilient in serving their community needs in a responsive way, and not what enables them to be comfortable for you to fund. Yep. Too much of what has been called capacity building, and my organization was a part of this, was creating the conditions in which nonprofits could do the things that made donors comfortable.
Right.
And this goes back to who's on your team as a donor. If you've got board members and staff members from those communities, they will see the assets in those communities that our systems don't. And there was a profound moment for me when one of my colleagues wrote a piece with Fred Ali, who was the head of the Weingart Foundation, amazing foundation leader out of LA. And they had a line in the piece I wrote where they said, financial analysis is not race neutral, which sounds either wonky, you're like, why do you care? But it's also really provocative for people who live and die by the idea that like gap accounting rules are objective. Well, I mean, really quickly, it turns out that one of the ways that, if as a foundation you say, well, if you haven't been able to generate a certain amount of revenue, then you probably aren't stable. Well, an organization that has lawyers giving pro bono services can count that as revenue. An organization that has, fathers and moms from the community who come into their after school center and read to the kids every day can't count that pro bono service as revenue. So they might look like they are less well supported in the community. I mean, literally the way your gap accounting rules produce the revenue number is building in these biases. So, and I totally agree with Marco. I just would push back on help them get the capacity to make you comfortable. It's, you got to go through the discomfort of realizing that a lot of what you're expecting from these organizations, you're actually not seeing the assets. If you think an organization to be stable needs a certain amount of minimum operating reserves, we had a client and we said, what's your operating reserve? They like, tiny organization led by a person in the community. He's like, what's that? We said, well, it's the amount of money you have if something goes wrong. And he said, oh, well, there's a guy who owns the only small business in town who said to me, if I ever need $30,000 to keep the center open because something falls on the roof or something else, he's good for it. That is functionally what you as a funder want, which is a resilient organization with a reserve. It's just never going to be reflected in the gap accounting rules, which we've now come to appreciate were built up by white supremacist culture. So, I think that's powerful, but a lot of it's about seeing assets and having the insights. And that's where the diversity point is not tokenistic or responsive, it's strategic if you want to actually be putting your money in the hands of the best organizations, best positioned to do great work.
Yeah.
So
the only last thing I'll mention, sorry, the only last thing to the earlier question is, I can't think of any of the names, but I think if you do some search around, because I've seen panels, been to conferences where folks have talked about the participatory grant making. I think there's increasingly foundations. It's not the large, at least I don't know of the large ones, but I can think of, again, which is why sadly I can't think of their name right now because they don't work in my part of town and I'm not familiar with them prior to this, but who have adopted fully participatory grant making practices and have managed to be quite successful and effective at it. So I think if folks do some searching for that, they will find some models and some examples of foundations who've done that successfully.
Great, thank you, Marco. And so in the last 5 minutes, just to close us out, I am law and policy director of an organization led by a Black male. We have a largely women of color staff. And so I know we have a market interest in this heightened philanthropic energy on racial equity and transforming justice for communities of color, sustaining past this moment. And so just in closing, if you can each take maybe 2 minutes to talk about, do you think that this momentum with a focus on racial equity and combating racial injustices will continue past this racial reckoning moment in time? And if you're more cynical, how do we combat that cynicism to make sure that does? And so I'll turn to Marco and then Antony and close us out.
That's a really great question. I mean, I don't know is the short answer, but what I would say is I think the best, at least at the moment, the best I can think of is that the best effort that I can think of to avoid this being sort of a flash in the pan is to keep talking about it, right? I mean, there is that risk people are going to talk about the fatigue, but I think in some ways, if it feels trendy, I think people will be able to get away with sort of saying that they've got fatigue and they will switch. and shift their focus to other, the latest shiny thing, as opposed to sort of these deep-seated systemic issues. But I think if people keep talking about them and keep highlighting and pointing out the ways in which they are impacting our lives every day, I think it's much harder for people to be like, let's not do that anymore, because it's sort of be like, it's not like it's no longer happening. So for me, I mean, that's the only advice I can give, is that I think that we need to make sure these conversations continue, because they remind everybody that this stuff hasn't gone away. It's not diminished. And even if we're making progress, we're not done.
Yeah. It is a great question. One thing we haven't talked about is demographics. This whole conversation and the timing of it is completely linked to the fact that for the last 6 years, the majority of children born in this country are kids of color. And we all know the number is 2040, 2044, depends about, you know, how Marco's constituents self-identify, but, you know, at some point that is, I really believe there is a huge part of this, which is just, it's a reckoning of a white supremacist country with its increasingly representative demographic reality. 19 out of 20 people in the world are not white men. So we're joining the rest of the world. We're creating a majority in our country that looks more like the rest of the world. And I think that's a huge part of it. So I used to feel before Trump got elected that we had this inexorable wind behind our backs. The people who cared about these issues, we might lose battles in the near term, but then in the long term, we just were going to win because of demography. And the other thing I've learned, and, you know, I grew up in South Africa as a white guy, so there's a lot you can learn about how white minorities hold on to power. And, you know, I think what I learned from the Trump election, it's naive that it took me that to figure it out, is just how the people who don't want to see this country become more inclusive are looking at the same demographics we're looking at, and they just have a different view about it, which is they don't see it as inexorable. They just see it as a you know, a fight they need to now wage to stop that translating into power. So I think this conversation is completely a part of that. And, you know, I agree with you guys. In 100 years, I can't believe that we're not going to have won this battle. But it's really relevant for those of us who are not too, that what happens in the next 10 years. So I think, to Marco's point, I talk about 2020, just talking to my clients around the country, I refer to it as it's the year of no more F's to give. The leaders of color that I know, just for a set of reasons you guys all know, stopped code switching as much, stopped holding back, and moved out of their own comfort zones in order to be more challenging. And I think we've got to both ask people to keep doing that, and then the people who have power and people who hold power because of their racial identity or because of their position in an organization have to honor that and recognize that you've got to reward that with real resources to sustain it. But you know, it was a horrible year in many ways. In many ways, it was an incredibly revelatory year about what we can achieve when we start telling the truth to each other and acting at the speed of opportunity in the communities we serve, and urgency, and not the bureaucratic complacency that too often pervades foundations. So I think if everyone can just step a little bit out of our comfort zones and hold on to that spirit, I'm very encouraged. And lastly, I know we're running out of time, but you let me dodge the question of whether white people have a role in all this. You know, there are not enough people of color in this country to get all the jobs done, and it would be outrageous to think that, you know, our white supremacist culture needs to be dismantled without white people putting our shoulder weight alongside everyone else. But I do think the fundamental nature of leadership does need to change. And I don't know that no grant should go to organizations led by white people, but I think be fascinated by operating in a society in which the default was that they didn't, unless a strong argument could be made that they should, rather than the default being that we go to the comfortable white-led organizations we know, and then someone has to make an exceptional argument for as to why they're worthy of the funding. I think if we flip the default, we'd find a way to harness everyone's talents. But I'm very sympathetic to that argument.
Well, thank you so much, Antony and Marco, for this candid conversation about philanthropy and racial equity. I'm so grateful to have engaged in it with you, and hope that everyone who tuned in tonight also learned a lot, just like I did as well. And so I'm happy to turn it back to Rachel to close us out. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Andrea and Marco and Antony, for sharing your thoughts and your resources and your experience, and really having a candid conversation. We're very grateful to be able to sponsor this with all of you. And thank you also for supplying some of the resources. We added those in the chats. We will share those when we do the video recording share in a couple of days. invite everyone to continue these conversations. I hope we can have some more of these programs. Thank you for joining us this evening. Continue on with your work. Please share resource questions, anything you like with YANA. We like to be able to pass things on and match people as well. So anything we can do to help out, we will. So thank you again. Have a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you at the next program, if not, hopefully live someday. So thank you.
Thank you all.